Lena had always known that the day would come when the old world would collide with the new one. She stood alone on her balcony, watching the 3 moons rise over the distant mountains. The cool night air carried the scent of the ancient forests that surrounded her home, forests that had existed for thousands of years before humans arrived with their ships and their promises of progress. Her 3 dragons slept in the chamber behind her, their massive forms curled around each other for warmth and comfort. She could hear their gentle breathing, the soft rumble of contentment that came from Storm, the largest of the 3. Azure and Blaze were nestled against Storm's side, seeking the security that only their bonded companion and her eldest dragon could provide. The communication device on her wrist had been silent for 3 days, and that silence troubled her more than any emergency message could have. Commander Victoria usually sent updates every morning, small reports about the progress of the human research facility in the valley below. The commander was one of the few humans who had taken time to understand Lena and her ways. She listened when Lena spoke of the dangers of digging too deep into the earth, of awakening things that were meant to remain sleeping. But Victoria was also a human with responsibilities to her own people, and progress was something that humans valued above almost everything else. Lena had watched her entire civilization transform over the past decade. The elves who had once lived in harmony with nature, who had built their homes within the living trees and moved through the forest like shadows, had gradually adopted human technology and human ways. They had learned to love convenience and speed. They had learned to value efficiency over tradition. Lena had refused to follow this path. She had remained in her ancestral home, a sprawling palace carved from a single mountain peak, and she had devoted herself to caring for her dragons and preserving the old knowledge. The 3 dragons had come to her as orphans. Storm had been barely alive when she found him, his wing torn and his scales covered in frost from a terrible storm that had ravaged the northern reaches of the continent. Azure had been trapped in a cave system, unable to find her way out to the open sky. Blaze had been captured by poachers and kept in a cage that was far too small for such a magnificent creature. Lena had rescued each of them, healed them with magic that flowed from her ancient bloodline, and trained them to trust and love her. Over the years, they had become more than pets or servants. They had become her family, her greatest treasure, and her connection to a world that was rapidly disappearing. She remembered the day when the human ships had first appeared on the horizon. She had been flying on Storm's back, exploring the upper atmosphere when she saw them, 3 massive vessels, sleek and silver, descending through the clouds with a grace that belied their size. They landed in the valley that was now home to the research facility, and thousands of humans emerged, ready to build and explore and understand this new world they had discovered. At first, there had been conflict. The elves had feared that the humans would destroy their culture and their home. But over time, most of the elves had come to see the humans as companions rather than invaders. They had shared technology, and in return, the elves had shared their knowledge of magic and their deep understanding of the natural world. It had been a fair exchange, or so most elves believed. Lena had disagreed. She believed that something precious was being lost in this exchange, something that could never be recovered once it was gone. She turned away from the balcony and walked back into her chamber. The dragon stirred at the sound of her footsteps. Storm lifted his massive head and regarded her with eyes that held ancient wisdom. The dragon had been her companion for 15 years, longer than the other 2, and they shared a bond that went deeper than simple affection. They could sense each other's emotions, could communicate through touch and through a strange language made of images and feelings rather than words. Lena moved to Storm and pressed her forehead against the dragon's snout. She closed her eyes and let her consciousness merge with the dragon's for just a moment. She felt his concern, his awareness that something in the world was changing. The dragons could sense disturbances in the natural order of things. They had a connection to the earth and the sky that humans would never fully understand, even with all their technology and their science. As she pulled away from Storm, her wrist device suddenly came to life. Not with a message from Victoria, but with an alarm. A loud, urgent sound that made even the dragons jump to their feet. The facility had sent out a distress signal. Something had happened, something serious enough to override the usual protocols and reach out to Lena directly. She immediately moved to her travel pack and began gathering supplies. Healing herbs in small pouches, a water flask made from dragon hide, a length of rope woven from materials that could withstand extreme heat, She had been prepared for this moment for years, knowing in her heart that eventually her skills and her dragons would be needed. The time had finally come. Storm lowered himself so that Lena could climb onto his back. She secured the harness with practiced efficiency, running her hands over the familiar leather and checking each connection twice. Azure and Blaze were already moving toward the great balcony, their wings spreading wide in preparation for flight. As they launched from the mountain peak, Lena felt the familiar rush of wind and the sense of weightlessness that always came with flight. The three dragons moved as one unit, a coordinated formation that they had perfected over countless journeys together. Below them, the world spread out in shades of blue and green and purple, beautiful and fragile and full of mysteries. The journey to the research facility would take several hours. Even at the fast pace that the dragons could maintain, Lena used the time to prepare herself mentally and emotionally for whatever they would find. She had learned long ago that worry was useless, that it drained energy that might be needed later. Instead, she focused on her breathing, on the connection she shared with her dragons, on the magical energy that flowed through her veins like liquid light. As they flew through the night, passing over forests and mountains and wide-open plains, Lena wondered what could have caused the alarm. An accident at the facility was always possible, but humans were generally careful with their equipment. An encounter with dangerous wildlife was another possibility, though the area around the facility had been relatively peaceful for months. Or perhaps it was something else entirely, something that the humans did not yet understand. Whatever it was, Lena knew that she would face it with courage and with her dragons at her side. She had dedicated her life to being the bridge between the old world and the new one, and now that dedication would be tested like never before. The research facility came into view just as the first rays of dawn began to paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. Lena could see immediately that something was terribly wrong. The neat arrangement of buildings and laboratories that she remembered from her last visit had been destroyed. Equipment lay scattered across the ground like toys discarded by a careless child. Smoke rose from several locations and there was a strange smell in the air, something acrid and wrong that made even the dragons hesitate. Storm descended rapidly, his powerful wings folding back as he approached the ground. The other two dragons flanked him, their eyes alert and their bodies tense with readiness. They had been trained to sense danger, and all three of them felt that something was very wrong here. As they landed near the edge of the facility, Lena could see that the destruction was even worse than it had appeared from the air. Buildings that had been solid and well constructed were now twisted metal and shattered polymer. One entire section of the facility had been reduced to rubble, as if something massive had walked through it without caring about what was in its way. Lena dismounted from Storm and immediately began moving toward the main laboratory building, her senses reaching out to detect any signs of life. She found the first survivor near the entrance to the lab, a young human male with a long cut across his arm and blood staining his uniform. He was sitting with his back against the wall, looking dazed and confused. When he saw Lena and the dragons, his eyes went wide with shock. Lena knelt beside him and quickly examined his wound. It was deep, but not life-threatening if it was properly treated. She reached into her pack and retrieved a small vial of healing ointment, something made from plants that grew only in her ancestral forests. The ointment had properties that human medicine could not replicate. She applied it carefully to the wound, and the young man gasped as the pain immediately began to fade. He tried to speak, his words coming out in gasps and broken sentences. "There had been an earthquake," he said. "No, not an earthquake. Something moving beneath the ground. Something massive. They had been drilling, trying to reach a deeper level of geological samples when suddenly the ground had shaken so violently that nothing could stand. The equipment had failed. Communications had been knocked out. And then they had heard it, a sound from deep beneath the earth, a sound like nothing any of them had ever heard before." Lena helped the young man to his feet and guided him toward Storm. The dragon lowered himself, making it easier for the injured human to climb onto his back. She needed to find Victoria and the other survivors. She needed to understand what had happened here. She moved deeper into the facility, following her instincts and the faint traces of magical disturbance that she could sense in the air. Her magic was most powerful in places where nature had been disrupted, where the natural order of things had been disturbed, and this place was screaming with disruption. In the central control room, she found Victoria and 5 other people huddled together. The commander's face was streaked with dust and sweat, and there was a wild look in her eyes that spoke of fear and confusion. When she saw Lena, a flood of relief washed across her features. Victoria rushed forward and grabbed Lena in a tight embrace, something that surprised the elf. Humans were generally more restrained in their physical affection. But Lena understood that Victoria was frightened and grateful. She returned the embrace briefly, then pulled back to look at the commander. Victoria began to speak rapidly, the words tumbling out of her mouth faster than Lena could process them at first. They had been drilling at depths never before reached in this location. The geological surveys had shown something unusual at that level, something that the scientists wanted to investigate. They had been excited about the possibility of discovering new mineral deposits or new forms of energy that could be used to power the human ships. But when they reached the designated depth, something had gone wrong. The drilling equipment had registered extreme resistance, and then the ground had begun to shake. At first, they had thought it was a natural earthquake, something not uncommon in this region. But the shaking had continued to grow stronger, and the seismic equipment had started detecting movement from multiple locations beneath the facility. Victoria led Lena to the monitoring station and showed her the data that had been recorded before the systems had begun to fail. The patterns were clear once you knew what to look for. The movement was not random. It was coordinated. It was purposeful. Something beneath the ground was moving toward the facility, something that was aware of what the humans were doing and was responding to it. Lena studied the data carefully, her ancient elven mind quickly grasping the patterns and meaning. She had read about this in the old texts, the histories that her people kept in the hidden libraries of their ancestral homes. There were creatures that had dwelt in the depths of the earth long before even the elves had walked upon the surface, creatures that had chosen to remain hidden, to remain undisturbed. Breaking through into their domain was something that no civilization, no matter how advanced, should attempt. She turned to Victoria and told her what she suspected. But before she could explain further, the ground began to shake again. The tremors started gently and grew steadily stronger. The lights in the facility flickered and died, plunging them into near-total darkness. Only the emergency lighting provided any illumination now, casting everything in a strange red glow. The seismic equipment running on backup power continued to record the movement. And it was clear that whatever was beneath them was getting closer to the surface. The movement was no longer distant and deep. It was rising, moving upward with clear intention and purpose. Victoria looked at Lena with desperation in her eyes. She asked if Lena could do something, if her magic could protect them or stop whatever was coming. Lena took the commander's hand and looked her directly in the eye. She told Victoria that running was not the answer. Fighting would be pointless. What they needed to do was communicate, to try to establish some form of understanding with whatever ancient creature was awakening beneath them. The dragons felt the vibrations in the ground and became restless. Storm's deep rumble of concern echoed through the facility. Azure and Blaze pressed close to Lena, seeking reassurance from their bonded companion. They knew that something extraordinary was about to happen, something that would change everything. And they were ready to face it with Lena, as they had faced every challenge in their lives together. The night was far from over, and the most difficult part of Lena's journey was only just beginning. Lena moved with purpose through the corridors of the research facility, past the frightened scientists and technicians who watched her with a mixture of hope and confusion. She had made a decision. The only way to prevent disaster was to make contact with the creature beneath the earth, and the best place to do that would be at the epicenter of the disturbance, directly above where the seismic equipment was detecting the strongest movement. Victoria followed close behind, her human curiosity overriding her fear. The commander had seen enough of Lena's abilities over the years to know that the elf woman was not taking a reckless action. There was a reason for everything that Lena did. She had a plan, even if she had not fully explained it to the humans. They exited the facility through a damaged section of the wall and made their way to an open area that had once been a landing pad for the supply ships. The three dragons followed at a distance, not crowding but maintaining their protective presence. Storm was the most anxious, his tail swishing back and forth in agitation. He did not like being separated from Lena, even by a small distance. But she had instructed him to stay back, to observe from a safe point where he could see the entire area. The ground was unstable beneath their feet. shifting and moving as whatever was beneath the surface continued to rise. Cracks had appeared in the hard-packed earth, thin at first but growing wider as the minutes passed. Lena walked to the very center of the open area and stood completely still. She closed her eyes and began to breathe in a slow, controlled rhythm. Victoria watched in fascination as a soft glow began to emanate from Lena's body. It was a pale blue light, beautiful and ethereal, something that seemed almost unreal in the context of the destroyed facility and the chaos surrounding them. The light grew brighter and began to spread outward in waves, washing over the ground like ripples in water. Lena was reaching out with her magic, extending her consciousness deep into the earth, past layers of rock and mineral, past underground rivers and caves, to the place where the ancient creature was awakening. She was not trying to stop it or control it. She was simply opening a channel of communication, offering the possibility of dialogue instead of conflict. The response came gradually at first, a tingling sensation that grew stronger with each passing second. The ground beneath them began to glow with the same pale blue light that surrounded Lena. It was as if the earth itself was responding to her call, resonating with her magical energy. Then came the sound. It started as a deep rumble, barely perceptible, and grew progressively louder until it filled the entire world. It was not a roar exactly, though it contained elements of that. It was something more complex, a combination of sounds that seemed to contain meaning and intention. It was the voice of something ancient, something that had not communicated with the surface world in countless ages. Victoria took an involuntary step backward, stunned by the sheer magnitude of the sound. It vibrated through her entire body, making her teeth ache and her heart race. She had never experienced anything like it. It was terrifying and awe-inspiring at the same time. The ground directly in front of Lena split open, a long, wide crack that revealed the darkness beneath. And from that darkness something enormous began to emerge. First came the head, massive and covered in scales that seemed to shift between green and gold and deep purple, depending on how the light hit them. The eyes that opened were older than mountains. They held intelligence and memory and power that dwarfed anything that Victoria had ever encountered. The ancient dragon pulled itself upward, coil after coil of massive body emerging from the earth. It was impossibly large, far larger than Storm, who was already the biggest creature that Victoria had ever seen. This dragon was the size of a small mountain. Its scales alone were the size of a human's torso. When it moved, the very air seemed to shift and respond, but it did not attack. It did not threaten. It simply regarded Lena with those ancient eyes, and in that regard there was recognition. Two beings of magic, separated by countless years and by the vast difference in their sizes and power, acknowledged each other. Lena opened her eyes and looked directly at the creature. The exchange that followed was silent to Victoria's ears, but she could sense that something was being communicated. Images flashed through Victoria's mind, though she did not know how they got there. She saw the world as it had existed thousands of years ago, when the ancient dragons had ruled the skies and the depths. She saw their conflict with the first humans, saw the wars that had raged and the treaties that had eventually been signed. She saw the dragons retreating to the deep places of the world, choosing isolation over continued conflict. And she saw this particular dragon choosing to sleep, to wait in the depths, hoping that someday the surface world would learn wisdom and restraint. But human curiosity and the human hunger for progress had awakened it. The drilling, the digging, the disturbance of the deep places had pulled it from its slumber. The dragon lowered its massive head closer to Lena, and the elf reached out her small hand to touch the creature's snout. The moment her skin made contact with the dragon's scales, a final burst of communication passed between them, a message for the humans, a warning, a plea, and an ultimatum. The ancient dragon began to withdraw, moving back down into the depths from which it had emerged. The cracks in the ground began to close, the magical glow faded, and gradually the world returned to something approaching normal. But everything had changed. Lena turned to look at Victoria, and the commander could see the weight of responsibility in the elf woman's eyes. Victoria knew that whatever message the ancient dragon had communicated, it was something that would require humans to make difficult choices and to fundamentally change the way they approached their presence on this world. The age of unrestricted exploration and exploitation was ending. A new age was beginning, one where humans would have to learn to share this world with other species and to respect the ancient powers that dwelled in the places they could not see. The aftermath of the ancient dragon's emergence was chaotic. Scientists rushed around trying to salvage equipment and gather data. Medics treated the injured. Engineers assessed the damage to the facility. But through it all, there was a strange sense of purpose and clarity that had not existed before. Everyone understood without needing to be told that something fundamental had changed. Lena walked through the facility with Victoria at her side, explaining to the humans what the ancient dragon had communicated. Victoria translated Lena's words to the other scientists and technicians, conveying the dragon's message with as much clarity as she could manage. The creature beneath the earth had slept for 3,000 years. It had watched from its hiding place as civilizations rose and fell on the surface above. It had been tolerant of the elves, recognizing them as beings who understood the balance of nature and respected the ancient powers that existed in the world. But the arrival of humans had disturbed this balance. The humans, with their machines and their hunger for knowledge and progress, had begun to change the world in ways that could not be undone. The drilling at the facility had been the final transgression. By reaching down into the deep places of the earth, the humans had violated an ancient compact that had been established in the distant past. The compact stated that certain places would remain undisturbed, sanctuaries where the ancient powers could rest and exist in peace. But the dragon was not demanding that the humans leave the world. It was not issuing a call for war or conflict. Instead, it was offering an alternative. If the humans could demonstrate that they were capable of restraint and wisdom, that they could learn to exist on this world without destroying it or disturbing the sacred places, then coexistence was possible. However, there were conditions. All excavation and drilling that went beyond a certain depth would be prohibited. The deep places of the earth would be protected and respected. The forests would not be further cleared for human expansion. And the humans would work with the elves to establish a council that would oversee the interaction between the two species and ensure that the balance was maintained. Victoria listened carefully as Lena explained all of this. The commander's face showed the struggle she was having with these demands. The humans had come to this world to expand, to explore, to take advantage of the resources that existed here. Being told that they could not dig deeper or expand further went against everything that their mission was supposed to accomplish. But Victoria was also intelligent enough to understand that the alternative was conflict with a creature so powerful that all of human technology might not be enough to defend against it. She asked Lena if the ancient dragon would keep its word, if coexistence was truly possible. Lena considered the question carefully before responding. She told Victoria that the ancient dragon was older than any human civilization, older than recorded history itself. It had no reason to lie or to trick the humans. Its power was so great that it did not need deceit. If it had wanted to destroy the facility, it could have done so without any effort. Instead, it had chosen to emerge and communicate. That was a sign of good faith, a genuine desire for peace and coexistence. Over the following days, Lena worked with Victoria to establish the preliminary framework for what would become known as the Treaty of Coexistence. The agreement outlined the boundaries that humans would respect, the areas that would be protected, and the structure of the council that would oversee compliance. But not all humans were happy with the treaty. There were factions within the human government that saw it as a restriction on progress, as an unnecessary limitation placed on their civilization by beings who did not share human values or human ambitions. They argued that the ancient dragon had been a threat and should have been dealt with as a threat, not accommodated. Victoria found herself in the middle of a political battle that would determine the future of human presence on the world. She had to convince the skeptics that coexistence was not only possible but necessary. She had to explain that respect for other species and for the natural world was not weakness, but wisdom. And she had to do all of this while dealing with the damage to the facility and the recovery efforts that were ongoing. Lena remained at the facility throughout this process, a constant presence and a living reminder of what cooperation and communication could accomplish. The three dragons were frequently seen flying over the valley, a beautiful and peaceful sight that seemed to calm tensions and remind everyone of what was at stake. One afternoon, as Lena stood on a balcony overlooking the facility with Victoria, The commander turned to her and asked a personal question. She wanted to know why Lena cared so much about the humans, why the elf woman had risked so much to broker peace and prevent conflict. Lena could have simply let the ancient dragon handle the situation, could have let the humans and the creature come to their own resolution. Lena looked out at the valley and thought about how to answer. She said that she had seen what humans were capable of. They could be destructive and arrogant, yes, but they could also be capable of learning and growth. They had the potential to become something greater than their current limitations suggested. All they needed was someone to show them the way, to help them understand that progress and respect for nature and other species were not mutually exclusive. She said that she had come to care about some humans, that Victoria had become a friend and not just an ambassador or a contact. She believed that if humans and elves and dragons could learn to work together, then something truly remarkable could be built on this world. Not a world where one species dominated the others, but a world where all species contributed to the creation of something beautiful and lasting. Victoria listened and understood. The commander realized that Lena was offering something that humans often forgot to offer each other, let alone to other species. She was offering hope, and in that moment, Victoria resolved that she would do everything in her power to make sure that the Treaty of Coexistence became a reality, not just a document, but a living, breathing commitment to a better future. 6 months had passed since the emergence of the ancient dragon, and the beginning of the negotiations that would reshape human civilization on this world. Lena stood once again on the balcony of her mountain home, but this time she was not alone. Victoria stood beside her, looking out at the transformed landscape below. The research facility had been relocated to a new location that complied with the Treaty of Coexistence. New settlements were being built in designated areas that had been approved by the Council, and most importantly, the forest were beginning to recover from years of encroachment and exploitation. The treaty had been formally ratified by the human government just 1 week ago. The vote had been closer than anyone would have liked, with many politicians arguing against the restrictions that the treaty imposed. But in the end, reason had prevailed. The evidence of the ancient dragon's power, combined with Victoria's passionate testimony about what coexistence could accomplish, had convinced enough politicians to support the agreement. The newly formed Council of 3 Species would be headquartered in a neutral location that had been chosen by mutual agreement. Lena would serve as the representative of the elves and the dragons. Victoria would represent the humans, and a delegation of dragons led by an elder dragon named Meridian, who had lived for over 500 years, would represent the interests of the ancient creatures who dwelt in the deep places of the world. Storm walked out onto the balcony and pressed his massive head against Lena's shoulder. Azure and Blaze appeared moments later, completing the circle of bonded companions. The dragons had sensed the shift in the world's energy, the subtle change that indicated a new age was beginning. They were pleased with the outcome, pleased that their bonded companion had succeeded in creating a path toward peace. Victoria reached down and gently touched Storm's snout. The dragon had become comfortable with the human woman over the past months. He recognized her as an ally and a friend, someone who genuinely cared about Lena's well-being. That was enough for the ancient dragons to extend their trust. Lena turned to Victoria and thanked her for her support during the negotiations. The human woman had been instrumental in convincing her own people that coexistence was not only possible, but desirable. Victoria had written extensively about the encounter with the ancient dragon, describing it in terms that captured the majesty and intelligence of the creature. She had helped the other humans understand that they were not the only intelligent species in the universe, and that learning to respect and cooperate with other species was a sign of maturity, not weakness. Victoria laughed and told Lena that the real work was just beginning. The treaty would only be as good as people's commitment to upholding it. There would be those who would try to circumvent the restrictions, who would argue for special exceptions and exemptions. There would be conflicts and misunderstandings. There would be moments when the entire agreement seemed on the verge of collapse. But, Victoria added, there would also be opportunities for growth and cooperation. The humans had much to learn from the elves about living in harmony with nature. The elves could learn much from humans about innovation and building. And both species could learn from the ancient dragons about patience and the long view of history. Lena and Victoria made their way back inside. where they had arranged a celebration to mark the successful ratification of the treaty. The three dragons followed, and as they descended the spiral stairs that led to the great hall of Lena's palace, they could see that the space had been transformed for the occasion. Long tables had been arranged, laden with food and drink. Elven musicians played instruments that produced sounds of ethereal beauty. Human scientists and technicians mingled with elves and exchanged ideas. It was a celebration of possibility, a moment when two very different civilizations acknowledged that they could build something together, rather than against each other. As the evening progressed and the celebration continued around her, Lena found herself reflecting on how much had changed in such a short time. The world she knew had been transformed, but not in the way she had feared. Instead of humans destroying everything that was beautiful and ancient about this planet, they were learning to be stewards of it, to take responsibility for their impact and to work toward a sustainable future. She thought about the ancient dragons sleeping in the depths below, finally at peace with the knowledge that at least some of the surface dwellers had learned wisdom. She thought about all the possibilities that lay ahead, the discoveries that could be made when humans and elves and dragons worked together instead of in opposition. Storm approached her as the night wore on, and she placed her hand on his snout, allowing their consciousness to merge for a moment. Through the dragon's perception, she could feel the contentment that came from knowing that their world was safe, that the ones Lena loved would be protected, and that the future held promise instead of darkness. Victoria found Lena standing alone with Storm, and the commander sat down beside her friend. They did not need to speak. The understanding between them had grown deep enough that words were often unnecessary. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the celebration continue, watching elves and humans laugh together, watching dragons rest peacefully among beings who now treated them with respect and recognition of their value. As the night sky filled with stars, Lena whispered a prayer to the ancient forces that had guided her to this moment. She thanked them for giving her the strength to stand between two worlds and to forge a path toward peace, and she promised that she would spend the rest of her life, however long that might be, ensuring that this hard-won cooperation endured and flourished. The dragon sang a low, rumbling song of contentment and agreement, and somewhere deep beneath the earth the ancient dragon heard that song and was pleased. A new age had truly begun, an age where different species could live together, learn from each other, and create something greater than any of them could have created alone. The future was uncertain, as all futures must be, but it was a future filled with hope and possibility.